I never expected the stone-faced silence when Uncle Robert folded his newspaper and said, "Who's going to speak for Emily?" I glanced at my sister Claire, whose cheeks burned like embers under fluorescent light. We sat around the battered oak table in Grandpa's old dining room in Charleston, South Carolina, the walls papered with sepia family portraits, each face a testament to memories built and broken. The smell of roast turkey and honey-glazed ham lingered in the air, but nobody reached for the silver platter. My name hovered unspoken at the edge of every conversation. The taut atmosphere felt sharper than any blade. I felt the weight of years spent proving myself to relatives who saw me as the black sheep, the art school dropout who traded stability for paint-splattered deadlines. I was well aware they had bypassed me before, but this time, I would not stay silent. Finally, today, I had flown in 2 days earlier, leaving behind my cramped Brooklyn studio and a half-finished mural that waited patiently for my return. The rental car's tires hummed over Interstate 95 as I navigated through the Low Country's palmetto-lined highways. I rehearsed my introduction, determined to remind them of my accomplishments: solo exhibitions in New York, commissions from galleries, grant awards from prestigious art councils. But when I arrived, my trophy cases and framed accolades seemed to shrink in the shadow of old grudges. The cousins I barely knew exchanged stiff nods. Aunt Lorraine's polite smile carried the weight of decades spent nursing old slights. My father, who once embraced me tightly at every visit, now avoided eye contact, his gaze flicking toward my elder brother Matthew, the golden child who ran the family business. I realized that at this gathering, my successes meant nothing and my presence was an inconvenience. I watched as Aunt Denise placed a porcelain gravy boat on the table, her fingers trembling slightly. Everyone leaned in as though expecting her to spark conversation, but instead she launched into a rehearsed apology for past criticisms, one that conveniently omitted any mention of me. My heart pounded while I forced a steady smile, the kind that hides more than it reveals. Then Grandpa, who had remained silent all afternoon, cleared his throat. His frail voice carried across the room, "I will speak for Emily." Relief washed over me in warm waves. He reached into his coat pockets and withdrew a wrinkled envelope sealed with crimson wax. I recognized that emblem, my grandmother's crest from years of bedtime stories about family honor and legacy. As he raised the envelope, every eye turned to my father, whose face went pale. Suddenly, he stared at the envelope as if it had grown fangs. Aunt Lorraine gasped, her napkin twisting in her hands. Evelyn, my cousin, whispered something to Claire, but Claire's eyes slid to me, a silent plea for understanding. I felt something crack open inside me, an amalgam of relief and dread. Grandpa coughed and straightened his shoulders, his voice firm. "I appoint Emily executor of my estate." A gasp echoed through the room. I saw Uncle Robert's jaw clench, and Denise's knuckles whiten, and my father slump forward as though punched in the gut. As Grandpa extended his frail hand, the envelope wavered. I moved to take it, my palms slick with sweat. That moment, I realized I had not flown 500 miles for closure or reconciliation. I had come to claim what was rightfully mine. The afternoon sunlight strained through lace curtains, casting elongated shadows across the table, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of something changed. I tucked the envelope into my jacket pocket, careful to shield its seal from prying eyes. The relatives stirred uneasily, their chatter hushed. Claire reached across the table and squeezed my hand. A silent alliance formed in that brief touch. Beside me, my sketchbook lay open, its blank pages waiting like witnesses. I thought of the portrait I'd painted of Grandma on her 80th birthday, the one that captured the sparkle in her eyes before illness dimmed them. She had trusted me then, believed in my vision. Now her last words, written in delicate script, would guide the distribution of family heirlooms, property, and fortune she had amassed in goodwill and investments. I wondered which of them had thought of her as more than a matriarch to be honored, forgotten. The weight of responsibility pressed against my ribs, but exhilaration bloomed. For time, I felt seen and purposeful at last. I stood to leave. I heard my father whisper to my brother, "This isn't over." I paused at the doorway, his words slicing through my relief like hidden blade. I turned. "It is over," I replied softly, but with conviction. I walked down the hallway past Grandma's faded wallpaper and the mahogany banister that bore her silver picture frames. Outside, Spanish moss draped the oak trees like ancient veils, and the afternoon haze lent the garden an otherworldly calm. I felt every step echoing with the promise of transformation. They had passed me over, but I had rewritten the script. I was no longer a footnote in their stories but the author of my own. I climbed into the rental car, heard the engine roar to life and smiled. The envelope lay heavy against my heart, a reminder that legacy belongs to those brave enough to claim it. The envelope heavy in my jacket felt like a ticking time bomb, each crease in its seal marking memories I had inherited. I pressed my foot down on the accelerator, the rental car's engine roaring in protest, but inside me a different engine throbbed, a pulse of determination and anticipation. I knew the real battle would begin when I returned home. The drive back to Brooklyn was surreal. I replayed every face around that dining table, every whispered assumption that I was unworthy of my grandmother's final wishes. I thought of Uncle Robert's eyes, cold and accusatory, my father's pity masquerading as concern. Back in my cramped studio apartment, I faced a chaos of half-finished canvases and scattered brushes. The envelope sat on my drafting table, its presence commanding attention. I traced a wax seal with a trembling fingertip, wondering why she trusted me above all others. I opened the envelope slowly, careful not to rip the parchment-thin paper. Inside lay a single sheet, her elegant handwriting curling across the page. She had included detailed instructions: distribute the ancestral farmhouse on Sullivan's Island to Claire, leave the company shares to Matthew, and entrust me with her art collection and the charitable foundation she had founded in Memphis. Her words carried a weight I had never known. "Emily, my dearest, you have always seen the beauty in the broken. Now I entrust you to heal." The responsibility settled over me like a dense fog. I spent the next morning cataloging her artworks. Oil paintings of misty harbors, charcoal sketches of crowded Memphis streets, watercolors of magnolia blossoms. Each piece whispered fragments of her life, and I felt tears blur my vision more than once. I photographed every signature and made detailed notes, knowing that these records would serve me well when family members began to contest the terms. My phone buzzed constantly with messages I did not answer. By evening, my phone rang. It was Uncle Robert. His voice was low and controlled, but I heard the tremor beneath his words. He wanted to negotiate. Perhaps there's a way to honor Grandma's wishes without leaving anyone empty-handed. I smiled sadly at the ceiling of my studio, imagining him twisting her words for his benefit. I agreed to meet him at a cafe in Williamsburg the next day, secretly hoping that the public setting would restrain his more aggressive demands. I reviewed my grandmother's letter again. Morning arrived with drizzle, the streets slick and reflective. I sat in the corner of the cafe, swirling a latte and scanning the street through steamy glass. When Robert arrived, he wore a navy suit that looked too new, as if he had dressed for a courtroom rather than coffee. He slid into the seat opposite me, eyes darting over my notes. "Emily," he began, "I know Grandma loved you, but you have to consider the family's future." I leaned forward, steel in my voice. He argued that the foundation needed his guidance, that I was too scattered, too artistic to manage money and people. He claimed Claire would struggle to maintain the farmhouse without his advice. As he spoke, I realized he saw my grandmother's wishes as obstacles to control and profit. I set the letter on the table and said, "These are her instructions, not suggestions." His brow furrowed. When I reminded him of lawyer visits scheduled next week, his composure slipped. I watched him weigh his options, the line between negotiation and manipulation blurring. He sighed and leaned back, tension flooding his features. "I don't want to fight, Emily." He ran a hand through his hair. "But you're making choices that affect all of us." I folded my arms and watched raindrops race down the window. "Those choices were hers," I replied. "I'm not interested in what you want, only what she wanted." He hesitated, then nodded curtly. Our meeting ended with polite farewells. but I felt victory tremble on the edge of uncertainty. I tucked the letter back into its envelope as I exited into the damp afternoon. That night, sleep evaded me. The city lights outside my window flickered, reminding me of moments of revelation in countless paintings. I reached for my sketchbook and began to draw the oak tree in my grandmother's garden, its branches drooping like weary arms. With each stroke, I released frustration and fear. I jotted lines of possible legal strategies and wrote questions. In the margin, should I involve a neutral trustee? Could I offer Claire more flexibility? The more I planned, the more I felt the stirrings of confidence returning. The next morning, determination propelled me out of bed before sunrise. I dressed in a crisp blouse and tailored pants, signaling to myself the seriousness of the day ahead. I headed to my grandmother's office in Memphis where the foundation's records were stored. Arriving at the back entrance, I unlocked the door with the key Grandma had given me long ago. Inside, the scent of aged paper and leather-bound ledgers filled the air. I retrieved the files listing donors and grants. As I sorted through the documents, I noticed discrepancies suggesting mismanagement. A cold thrill ran down my spine. This discovery could vindicate my transparency. Armed, I returned to Brooklyn to face anyone who challenged her wishes. I arrived at the county courthouse before 8 in the morning, pressing the envelope firmly in my coat pocket as if it were a shield. The marble steps glowed under the rising sun, and I felt every beat of my heart echoing off their cold surface. My lawyer met me at the entrance, her briefcase in hand and confidence in her stride. We exchanged a curt nod before entering the lobby where the buzz of other cases and distant conversations formed a steady drone. I reminded myself that today, I was not seeking approval but justice for my grandmother's true wishes. The courtroom was hushed when we took our seats. I recognized Uncle Robert and my father on the opposite side, flanked by their own counsel. Matthew sat beside them, his posture rigid, eyes fixed on the judge's bench. Claire was in the gallery, her expression anxious but supportive. I inhaled deeply, recalling Grandma's final letter and the hope she'd placed in me. When the clerk called the case, I stood and followed my lawyer forward. The judge peered down at us, his gavel poised, and I felt the weight of every unspoken word at that family lunch settling around me like dust. My lawyer opened with a clear statement. My grandmother's will explicitly appointed me executor and detailed her distribution plan. She presented the signed and witnessed document, its crimson seal unbroken until I had opened it, and the typed addendum where Grandma explained her choice. Then she pointed to the spreadsheets documenting the foundation's finances files I'd uncovered in Memphis showing irregularities and potential self-dealing by Uncle Robert. The courtroom's hush deepened. I watched as questions formed on the faces of my relatives. It was no longer just a family quarrel but a matter of legal record. When it was my turn, I spoke calmly and deliberately. I recounted the moments at that family lunch, how my name had been passed over and the relief when Grandpa announced his intention. I described the hours spent cataloging her art, photographing every brushstroke and signature so no one could deny her meticulous care. I explained the burden I felt in safeguarding her legacy and the betrayal in discovering mismanaged funds meant for charitable outreach. Each word rang clear in the courtroom, and I felt Grandma's spirit guiding me, urging me onward with serene determination. Uncle Robert's lawyer tried to undermine my credibility, suggesting I was biased and overly emotional, that I lacked the business acumen to run the foundation. But when I presented evidence of my successful exhibitions and the steering committee I'd formed of qualified advisors, the argument crumbled. My father rose to testify but faltered under cross-examination, admitting he had pressured Grandma in her final months to revise her will. The confession landed like a hammer strike. I saw Claire squeeze her hands together, relief and sorrow mingling behind her eyes as the truth came to light. The judge retired briefly to deliberate. In those moments, the air felt thick, every breath weighted by anticipation. I stared at the envelope in my lawyer's hands, its promise of resolution tantalizingly close. Minutes felt like hours, but finally the judge returned, his robes rustling. He commended the clarity of Grandma's instructions and ruled that the will was valid, that I was to serve as executor, and that any issues of mismanagement within The foundation would be overseen by an independent auditor. He ordered that the distribution proceed immediately under court supervision. A tumult of emotions washed over me. I bowed respectfully, fighting tears of relief and vindication. My relatives sat in stunned silence. Uncle Robert's face was ashen, and my father looked stricken. Claire rushed forward, enveloping me in a tight hug that felt like coming home. Outside the courtroom, reporters clamored, but I focused on Claire's steady presence beside me. We walked down the courthouse steps together under the bright afternoon sun, the envelope now empty of secrets but heavy with closure. In the weeks that followed, I coordinated with Claire and Matthew to implement Grandma's plan. The Sullivan's Island farmhouse passed to Claire, who had already arranged for its restoration. Matthew received his shares but agreed to respect the company's charitable arm. I curated Grandma's art collection, working with museum professionals to create a traveling exhibit that celebrated her life's work. The foundation's board convened, and I appointed an external auditor, ensuring transparency and accountability. Each step felt like honoring her memory and fulfilling her final request. Throughout this process, I discovered untapped strengths within myself, organizational skills I hadn't recognized, empathy that guided every decision, and a firm resolve to uphold integrity. I learned that leadership was not about wielding power but about stewardship, protecting what mattered and empowering others. The family dinners that once brimmed with tension transformed into gatherings where I was thanked for my dedication. Apologies were offered, and while not all wounds healed completely, a tentative peace settled among us, built on newfound respect. Back in my Brooklyn studio, I unpacked my brushes and opened a fresh canvas. I began to paint the oak tree from Grandma's garden, its branches reaching skyward, roots curling deep into the earth. Layer by layer, color and texture formed a tribute to her resilience and vision. With each stroke, I felt her presence, a reminder that legacies endure when they are nurtured with love and honesty. The walls of my workspace, once cluttered with unfinished projects, now held space for clarity and purpose. As I stepped back to survey the completed mural, I know this is not just a painting but a testament to how far I've come. I claimed my place in the family not through confrontation but through dedication to Grandma's ideals. The envelope that once felt like a weapon has become a symbol of trust passed across generations. The oak tree stands immortal on my wall, its image a daily prompt that I am both guardian and inheritor of something greater than myself. And so this final chapter closes, not with an end but with the promise of all the stories yet to be painted.